The moment Vivian Aldridge mentioned that her ex was back in town, she didn't appear concerned. Instead, she looked entertained, even intrigued to see how Nolan Prescott would respond. "My ex is back in town and wants to meet up." She didn't offer any further explanation. She delivered the statement with a slight smirk that sat somewhere between self-assurance and challenge. Nolan Prescott simply gave a single nod. "Okay." That was all he said. Vivian waited. She had anticipated questions. She had expected some tension, perhaps even irritation. Instead, she observed Nolan reach for his glass of water and take a relaxed sip, as if he were hearing about the next day's forecast. His complete indifference unsettled her more than any heated exchange ever could. Vivian Aldridge had always excelled at interpreting emotional cues. She worked in corporate consulting, where reading people and using emotional leverage was basically part of the job. But Nolan Prescott had always been hard to decipher whenever he turned silent like this. He had built his career in financial litigation in Greenwich, Connecticut, where patience and quiet often secured victories long before anyone stepped into the courtroom. And in that instant, his silence felt intentional. The dinner table between them suddenly seemed wider than usual. Vivian examined him closely. "You're not curious?" Nolan gave a small shrug. "I trust you'll do whatever you believe is right." The words sounded polite, yet the tone carried something cooler than mere politeness. Vivian leaned back in her chair. "You're surprisingly calm about this." Nolan offered a faint smile. "Should I not be?" Vivian held his gaze for a moment longer before looking away. That brief reaction told Nolan everything he needed to know. The meeting with her ex had already been arranged. This wasn't a genuine question, it was a test. Vivian Aldridge had a tendency to probe emotional limits, the way others might dip their toes into unfamiliar water. Nolan Prescott had recognized this trait in her well before they got married. But recently, those tests had grown sharper, more deliberate, and more visible. Her ex's name was Adrian Calloway, a venture capital analyst she had dated briefly before meeting Nolan. Adrian had always lingered quietly on the outskirts of her social world. Occasional references, old anecdotes, incomplete comparisons. Nolan never showed strong reactions to those stories. At least not outwardly, because inwardly he had been noting every detail. And when someone pays close attention over time, they start noticing patterns that others overlook. That evening, Nolan finished dinner without any fuss. He helped clear the table. He washed the glasses in the kitchen while Vivian scrolled through messages on her phone. The house in Greenwich featured large windows overlooking the dark backyard, where high-end landscape lights created long, silent shadows across the grass. Everything about their home projected stability. Yet stability can sometimes conceal cracks more effectively than disorder ever could. Later that night, Nolan sat in his home office reviewing case files involving corporate contract fraud. Still, his thoughts kept returning to the brief exchange at dinner. Not because he felt threatened by Adrian Calloway, but because of how Vivian had phrased her statement. "You don't need the details." It wasn't the secrecy that troubled him. It was the assumption that he would simply accept being excluded from the context of his own marriage. That assumption revealed something significant about how she viewed the balance of power between them. And power imbalances seldom fix themselves without repercussions. 2 days later, Vivian dressed thoughtfully before heading out. She selected a navy dress that combined sophistication with ease. Nolan noticed the choice but said nothing. She paused by the doorway. "You're not going to ask where we're meeting?" Nolan glanced up from his laptop. "No," she tilted her head slightly. "You really don't care?" Nolan closed his laptop unhurriedly. "I care about many things, but curiosity isn't always useful." Vivian studied him once more. The absence of any pushback was starting to feel unsettling. She had anticipated resistance, but resistance gives the other person something to control. Calmness removes that leverage completely. Before leaving, she gave him one final searching look. "You're acting strange today," Nolan smiled gently. "I'm being attentive." She left without responding. The sound of her car leaving the driveway echoed through the silent house. Nolan stayed seated for several minutes. Then he reopened his laptop and began examining financial records. Not work-related ones, personal ones. Over the past year, Nolan had quietly restructured several financial arrangements tied to their assets. Nothing unlawful, nothing misleading, simply prudent preparation. Because the moment someone starts testing limits, a smart person begins preparing for where those tests might lead. Vivian returned home after midnight. She entered carrying the subtle scent of a restaurant Nolan recognized from downtown Greenwich. She set her purse on the counter casually. "How was your evening?" Nolan asked. "Interesting." She opened the refrigerator and poured herself sparkling water. "Adrian is doing quite well these days." Nolan nodded politely. "That's nice to hear." Vivian observed him closely. "Don't you want to know what we discussed?" Nolan shook his head slowly. "If it impacts our lives, I'm sure you'll share it when you're ready." Her smile reappeared, but this time it was smaller. Almost wary, because she still couldn't determine whether Nolan's composure signaled confidence or detachment. And sometimes those two things appear identical until it's too late. 3 weeks passed. Adrian's name came up in conversation more often. Casual references, offhand comparisons. Vivian never crossed any obvious boundary, but she seemed to take pleasure in watching Nolan handle the uncertainty. Then one evening, Nolan arrived home earlier than expected. He found Vivian in the living room talking quietly on the phone. She ended the call abruptly when she noticed him. "That was Adrian," she said lightly. Nolan nodded. "I figured," she leaned forward a little. "He invited me to a networking event in Manhattan this weekend." Nolan looked at her steadily. "Sounds professional." "It is." She watched his reaction again. "Would you mind if I went?" Nolan paused just long enough for the question to register. Then he said something Vivian hadn't anticipated. "You should definitely go." Her eyebrows rose slightly. "You're serious?" "Of course. Why wouldn't I be?" Vivian leaned back in her chair slowly. "You've been unusually supportive lately." Nolan stood and walked toward the kitchen. "Support is often undervalued in relationships." She followed him with her eyes, but something in his tone now carried a subtle sense of closure she couldn't quite define. The Manhattan event took place that Saturday evening. Vivian left the house feeling confident, but she returned Sunday morning feeling unsettled, not because anything dramatic had occurred, but because Nolan hadn't sent even one message, not a single text, not even a simple check-in. When she walked into the house, she found him sitting in the kitchen, drinking coffee and reading a legal document. "You didn't ask how the event went," she said. Nolan looked up calmly. "How was it?" She hesitated for a moment. "Adrian and I talked quite a bit." Nolan nodded once. "Good." Vivian set her bag down slowly. "You're making this very easy." Nolan smiled faintly. "Sometimes the easiest path shows the most clearly." Before we continue, pause for a moment and reflect on this situation. If you were Nolan Prescott, would you remain composed the way he did? Or would you address the situation head-on? Share your thoughts in the comments. Because this is the point where most people make the choice that shapes everything that comes afterward. 2 months later, the change finally became noticeable. Nolan Prescott had accepted a senior partnership position with a financial litigation firm in Boston. The offer had been under quiet discussion for several weeks. Vivian found out by chance when a congratulatory email popped up on Nolan's open laptop. "You're moving to Boston?" she asked sharply. Nolan looked up from his desk. "I accepted the position yesterday. You didn't tell me? You didn't ask?" Her voice grew firmer. "What about our life here?" Nolan leaned back in his chair calmly. "I'm keeping the Greenwich house for now, but I'll be spending most of my time in Boston." Vivian stared at him. "You're making a major decision without talking to me about it." Nolan folded his hands thoughtfully. 2 months ago you explained that some conversations don't require details." The words settled quietly between them, not aggressive, not emotional, just exact. Vivian understood something then that disturbed her deeply. Nolan Prescott hadn't been passive. He had been adjusting. Their marriage had gradually moved from joint decisions to separate paths. Not because of anger, but because of adaptation. And adaptation often brings consequences long before anyone notices them. 6 months later, the distance between Boston and Greenwich had become normal. Phone calls were courteous but short. Visits were arranged around work schedules. Vivian still met Adrian occasionally in social settings, but something about those encounters now felt empty, because the tension she once used to gauge Nolan's responses had disappeared completely. One evening she called Nolan without warning. "Are we still married?" she asked quietly. Nolan paused before replying. Yes, but we're also two people making our own choices. Just like you suggested that night at dinner. Vivian sat silently on the other end of the line. For the first time since that conversation months earlier, the full weight of her words came back to her clearly. And words have an odd way of shaping reality once they've been spoken. Before the story ends, consider one more question. If someone gradually pulls away instead of arguing, is that maturity or the quiet conclusion of a relationship? Let us know what you think, because this moment often determines whether relationships grow or fade away. A year after Adrian returned to town, Nolan Prescott completed his permanent move to Boston. The legal documents for a marital separation came soon after. There was no big confrontation, no scandal, no blame. Just two signatures on a paper recognizing what had already taken place emotionally months earlier. Vivian Aldridge stayed in the Greenwich house for another year before eventually relocating to Manhattan for work. Adrian Calloway remained a distant acquaintance. The connection that once felt exciting gradually proved to be ordinary. And sometimes ordinary shows up too late to fix what ambition and curiosity had quietly undermined. Nolan Prescott continued advancing his career in Boston. He rarely discussed the marriage in public, but colleagues sometimes noticed how intentional he had become about emotional boundaries. Because when someone experiences a gradual shift in loyalty, they often learn a lasting lesson about attention and respect. And those lessons rarely need to be voiced aloud.